Good morning. I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Peter Huntsman, Chairman, President, and CEO of Huntsman Corporation, a global company with a storied name in chemical manufacturing business and a leader in innovation. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Marty, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So Huntsman has grown and evolved quite a bit in its 50-year history. To start with, perhaps you can give our audience an idea of what Huntsman's footprint looks like today and kind of where you see both Huntsman and the broader petrochemicals industry heading in the global economy.
I think the history of our company is probably quite reminiscent of what the industry by and large is doing. When I think of the history of our company, we started off making clamshell containers for hamburgers, plastic cutlery, plastic bowls and utensils and so forth. At the time, we were feted as being an environmentally sensitive company because we were replacing wax paper and wooden pulp and things that were far more environmentally destructive. Today, we don't produce we don't produce any plastics. We don't produce any polyethylene, polystyrene, or anything. We're producing the raw materials for Boeing. Every Boeing 787 has 21 tons of our products on a per plane basis. We're one of the largest manufacturers in the world that are making the chemical components that are going to electronic vehicles and batteries, wind blades, solar panels, building insulations, and so forth. So you just go on and on. And it's a vast world of chemistry. You do not advance civilization. You do not conserve energy today without our products and without our industry.
So Peter, what you described is a very diverse business line. I mean, everything from basic building block chemicals to high performance products and materials. But they all share a need for affordable and reliable energy, namely natural gas, both to run the operations, but also the feedstock source for your products. Of course, energy prices had quite a ride through the pandemic. And over the last year or so, we saw demand outpace supply around the world as lockdowns were lifted, making energy more expensive, especially in Europe and Asia. That was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has only exacerbated those tight markets. So how have those price spikes impacted your global operations?
That's a very good question. We're seeing changes today, Marty, that we have not seen in decades. The changes that I'm talking about, we used to price our products on a quarterly basis. It was not unusual to have prices in our industry that would be locked in for 3, 6, even 12 months at a time. We, in the last year, went from quarterly pricing to monthly pricing to weekly pricing, and now for the first time, literally in our industry's history, at least the products, particularly in Europe and in Asia, we're moving prices on a daily basis. Now, what this means is that when you look at this on a consumer point of view, stability in pricing, whether it be fertilizers, which is a raw material for the entire food industry, or you look at our insulation materials, which is the raw material for the entire cold chain process, getting food from the field freshly to the grocery store and so forth. That means these prices are going to be fluctuating and changing, I dare say, almost on a daily basis or weekly basis, because we've seen such massive movement in volatility. Let me just give you one number alone, just natural gas in Europe this last year. Natural gas in Europe started off the year at about $5 per MMBTU. That's equivalent to about $30 gas, or excuse me, $30 crude oil. So energy, $30 crude. In the last couple of weeks, we have seen it spike as high as $35 per MMBTU. That's the equivalency of over $300 a barrel crude oil. So imagine crude oil going upwards as high as $300 a barrel, crashing back down to $100 a barrel, up to $150 a barrel. And then you see intraday spikes where the price go as high as $450 a barrel. That means your price out on the gas pump would be fluctuating between $15 and $20 a gallon. That's what we're seeing in these volatile energy markets around the world. And so, so customers or suppliers like us that stand between the raw materials and the consumer, we have to push these products pricing through in faster ways than we've ever done in our history, because we've never seen volatility like this.
That's fascinating. So let's stick to the energy cost for a minute. I mean, you of course have had a front row seat to the U.S. Energy picture. 15 years ago, we saw high natural gas prices. Shale revolution ends up bringing costs down quite a bit, and chemical industry itself ended up putting a lot of capital into U.S. facilities. So now, as the largest producer of both natural gas and oil, the U.S. has been increasingly able to export supplies while still meeting our domestic needs. So let me first ask, whether the fact that we are now a net exporter of natural gas has affected your U.S. operations.
Well, when fracking hit the United States about 12 years ago, our industry invested over $150 billion into chemical expansions, chemical operations. These are engineering jobs, manufacturing jobs, trucking jobs, and these are not minimum wage retail jobs. These are the bread and butter of communities and cities. So competitive raw material pricing, competitive energy is hugely important to the millions of jobs, be it truckers, railroaders, manufacturers, engineers, scientists, and so forth, dependent on the world of chemistry. So hugely important. The problem I see now is that while the U.S. is balanced, on one hand, we're restricting production, we're restricting pipelines, we're making it overly complicated to drill, to build pipelines, to build infrastructure, to invest in that needed infrastructure. We can all talk about net zero economies and all this other stuff. It is nonsense to think that we're going to be anywhere close to that in the next couple of years. We have to get real into where we are today. So we're restricting supply of energy and natural gas. On the other hand, we're talking about exporting 15 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe to supplant the 150 billion cubic meters that Russia's presently bringing into Europe. And as we ship that product from the US, which are still realistically years away from doing because we don't have the capabilities to do so today, we're going to see US prices go up because of that. So I have no problem with us exporting gas, but let's make sure that we are doing an adequate job, and we're not doing this today, of making sure that we're building out the infrastructure to be able to produce and to move that natural gas, which is replacing coal, which is why the United States is cutting its CO2 in the last 10 years more than the next 10 countries combined.
Well, let's build on that thought, because I think it's an important point about the role that natural gas is going to play in the energy transition and decarbonization, around the world. So, as a company that operates on 6 continents, and you're a big consumer of energy as well. So, I guess let's just expand on your view of America's role in helping deliver those, new supplies of natural gas and oil, to allies and partners around the world. And as you pointed out, this is especially important when we're going to see with the sanctions on Russia that have taken and will take off of the market, supplies from one of the world's largest energy producers and exporters.
Marty, I have really mixed emotions in this. I got to be honest with you, because our company is about 35, almost 40% North America, about 30% European, and about 30% Asian, mostly China. Europe has almost the equivalence, and in some areas it has even greater opportunity for fracking than the United States does. So fracking is not just a US phenomenon. If Europe wanted to do it, if Europe wanted to transition out of coal and not be dependent on Russia, and to replace that coal with natural gas as they then transition to wind and nuclear and other areas that are even yet greener, they have those capabilities of doing so. But if they're going to forego that opportunity and become reliant on Russia, become reliant on the US, that's up to the Europeans, but they shouldn't do it at the competitiveness, and we shouldn't be exporting our energy resources at the competitiveness of our own manufacturers. We ought to be exporting cars instead of exporting the raw materials for metal and exporting energies. We ought to be looking to how we upvalue our energy assets in this country rather than just exporting them at the lowest possible cost.
And that gets back a bit to the point you made earlier about if we're actually built out the infrastructure that we need, then that does provide more of an opportunity to facilitate exporting some of our energy resources as we continue to do that. But let me change the topic a bit, and as we focus on the energy transition, efforts to decarbonize the economy, and frankly the ambitious goals that we all share to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we know we're going to need to build massive amounts of infrastructure and build it quickly. Now, Huntsman's built a lot of facilities in the U.S., so I'm wondering if I could ask you to describe how you look at the permitting process here in the U.S. and frankly, do you think it's consistent with the massive infrastructure build out that's needed to meet those ambitions?
No, it's nowhere close. I mean, we need to have, I feel like we're having a Marshall Plan to some degree on funding of the build out. We also need to have a Marshall Plan that's going to review the layers and layers of regulatory approvals, a Marshall Plan that's going to go through and figure out what is most needed on that approval process and clean out. A lot of these processes, we have to understand, listeners have to understand, they just build on previous years. So as we add, we don't subtract anything. And in many areas, we have environmental regulations that date back to the 60s, 70s, 80s. The EPA was created by Nixon in the 1970s. And we just keep getting more and more layers and layers and layers. We have EPA regulators, and we have a lot of other regulators outside the EPA that don't even know the federal laws. It literally takes weeks to be able to interpret regulations as to where we ought to be going. So it's great that we're putting aside all this money, and we're talking about building cars and building the supply chain and building the energy raw materials for electric batteries and so forth. We are the only North American producer that produces a pure carbonate. Now, pure carbonate, so raw material, goes into electrolytes. Electrolytes go into the manufacturing of EV batteries. We hear about all these EV batteries we want to onshore into North America. It takes us 9 to 10 months to build new capacities for electrolytes. It takes us almost 2 years to get the permits to be able to build that out. So it takes us longer to get the permits by a factor of 2, almost 3, than it does for us to be able to build out the facilities themselves. And they're talking about adding more regulations that may even take that permitting process upwards to 3+ years. So when we think about this regulation, we think about wanting to build out the infrastructure. We think about wanting to deliver cheap and affordable energy to people in New England, and we have pipelines that take 20 years to build over the Appalachians that ought to be taking us 6 months to build. That's where regulation doesn't just become a regulation. It just becomes a killer for these sort of advancements.
No, I think it's a critical point. As I say, we've got shared goals and shared ambitions on what we want to achieve from clean energy and infrastructure and just addressing the supply chain. But yeah, the regulations and permitting have got to follow along with that. Well, Peter, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I want to thank you again for joining us. And I really look forward to continuing this dialogue. So again, thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Great talking to you, Marty.